It was a quiet, rainy afternoon in Vermont. The old Miller house stood on the edge of town, surrounded by tall pine trees and wet leaves. Inside, Ethan Miller, a 28-year-old writer, was cleaning the attic that once belonged to his grandmother, Helen Miller, who had passed away 2 months ago. The attic smelled of dust and old paper. Wooden boxes, broken furniture, and forgotten memories were scattered everywhere. Ethan pushed open the small window to let the air in. A cold breeze entered, carrying the smell of rain. He whispered to himself, "Let's see what secrets you've been hiding, Grandma." Ethan wasn't looking for anything special. He just wanted to find his grandmother's old typewriter, something he remembered from his childhood. But as he moved a pile of books, something shiny caught his eye, a small wooden box covered in dust and cobwebs. He pulled it closer and blew on it. The box had a brass lock, but it was already broken. Inside, there was nothing but some dried flowers, a silver locket, and an old photograph. He picked up the photo carefully. It was faded, brown from age. A young woman stood under a cherry tree, smiling softly. She had short hair and wore a white summer dress. Around her neck was the same heart-shaped locket that was lying in the box. Ethan turned the photo around. On the back, in neat handwriting, someone had written, "For M, I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes." He frowned. "For M," he said aloud. His grandmother's name was Helen, not M. Who was this woman? Then he noticed something strange. The photo had been torn in half. The other person in the picture was missing. Only the woman remained. Ethan felt a chill. The attic light flickered above him. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. He sat down on an old trunk, staring at the photograph. It was beautiful but sad, like it carried a story no one had told in decades. He looked at the locket again. It opened easily. Inside was a tiny picture too faded to recognize. The faces were gone, but 2 shadows remained. "Maybe it's nothing," he whispered. "Just one of Grandma's old friends." But deep down, Ethan didn't believe that. There was something personal about the way the photo had been hidden. Why keep it locked away in a box under the attic floorboards? He decided to search for more. For the next hour, he opened box after box. Letters, postcards, magazines from the 1970s, but no clues about the woman in the photo. Finally, tired and covered in dust, Ethan sat by the small attic window. He held the photograph in his hands again. The woman's smile seemed to stare back at him. Outside, the rain fell harder, hitting the roof like 1,000 tiny drums. Ethan thought of his grandmother. She had always been kind but quiet about her past. She rarely spoke about her youth or how she met his grandfather, Thomas Miller. He remembered once asking her about it when he was a child. She had smiled and said, "Some stories are better kept in boxes, Ethan." Now he wondered, was this the story she meant? He looked around the attic again. Everything seemed still, but suddenly, the floor creaked. Ethan turned quickly, but no one was there. Just shadows moving with the lightning flashes. He laughed nervously. "You're just tired," he told himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. As the storm grew louder, he packed the photograph and locket into his pocket and decided to go downstairs. But before he could leave, something else caught his eye, a corner of a torn paper sticking out from under a stack of newspapers. He pulled it free. It was the edge of another photo, the other half maybe. But it was completely blank. The image side had faded away, leaving only a yellowed border. Disappointed, he set it aside and climbed down the attic ladder. That night, Ethan sat in his study, the photo lying beside his laptop. He tried to focus on his writing, but his eyes kept drifting back to the picture. The woman's gentle smile seemed almost alive in the lamplight. He zoomed in on the photograph using his phone camera, looking for any clue, a date, a place, a name, but there was nothing. Only the letter M and the promise, "I'll wait for you." Who was M? Who was waiting for her? Before going to bed, Ethan placed the photograph and locket on his nightstand. Outside, the storm began to fade. The house was silent again. He turned off the light and closed his eyes. But just as he was about to fall asleep, the old landline phone on his grandmother's desk began to ring. Ethan sat up quickly. No one had used that phone in years. The ringing continued, slow and heavy, echoing through the quiet house. He hesitated, then walked over and picked up the receiver. "Hello." For a few seconds, there was only static. Then, a low, calm voice spoke. "You shouldn't have found that photo." Ethan froze. "Who is this?" The line went dead. He stood there, breathing hard, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. He looked back at the photograph lying on the table, and for a brief moment, he could swear the woman's smile looked different, almost like she knew he had heard the voice. Thunder rumbled again in the distance. Ethan slowly placed the receiver back down, his hand shaking. He looked around the empty room, whispering to himself, "Grandma, what did you hide from me?" Outside, lightning flashed, and in that brief light, the attic window upstairs seemed to glow, as if someone was standing there, watching. Ethan barely slept that night. The voice on the phone kept echoing in his mind, "You shouldn't have found that photo." By morning, the rain had stopped. The house was quiet again, but something felt different, heavier, almost as if the walls remembered what had been said. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, sipping cold coffee. The photograph and locket were lying beside his notebook. He looked at them again and whispered, "Who are you?" He knew he couldn't let it go. He needed to find out who the woman in the picture was and why someone didn't want him to know. After breakfast, Ethan drove to the Maplewood Town Library, a small brick building that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. He told the librarian, Mrs. Green, that he was doing research on his family history. "Thomas and Helen Miller," he said. "Do you have any old newspaper records from the 1970s? Mrs. Green smiled politely. "Oh, we have everything from the 70s. Follow me, dear." She led him to the archives room, rows of dusty files, old newspapers, and microfilm machines. The lights flickered softly above them. For the next 2 hours, Ethan scanned through local papers from 1973, 1974, 1975. Nothing. He almost gave up until one headline made him freeze. "Local girl vanishes before wedding, June 1975. He leaned closer. The photo beside the article made his heart skip a beat. It was her, the same woman from the attic photograph. The article read: Margaret Hayes, 22, disappeared 1 week before her planned wedding to local man Thomas Miller. No trace of her was ever found. Authorities closed the case in 1976. Ethan's hands began to shake. Thomas Miller. That was his grandfather. He whispered, "That's impossible." He flipped through more pages and found an engagement photo: Thomas and Margaret standing together by a lake, smiling. Thomas looked younger but unmistakably familiar, the same blue eyes, the same jawline Ethan saw in his own reflection. He read the last line of the article again. Thomas Miller married another woman 2 years later, Helen Carter, a nurse from Burlington. Ethan sat back in the chair, staring at the paper. His grandparents had always told him they met in college. But this was a completely different story. Why would they hide it? What happened to Margaret Hayes? He copied the article on his phone and thanked Mrs. Green before leaving. Outside, the air was cold, the sky still heavy with clouds. He drove straight to the old lake mentioned in the article. It was quiet there, a forgotten place at the edge of town. The same cherry tree from the photograph still stood by the water, its branches bare and thin. Ethan walked closer and ran his fingers over the rough bark. That's when he saw it, letters carved into the trunk. T+M. The carving was old, but someone had recently traced over it with a knife, keeping it fresh. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He whispered, "Thomas and Margaret." He took a few pictures and looked out across the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the gray sky. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed something: a woman standing on the opposite side of the lake. She wore a long gray coat and a scarf over her head. Even from a distance, her face looked strangely familiar. Ethan blinked, and when he looked again she was gone. His heartbeat quickened. He ran around the lake, but there was no one there. Just the sound of the wind and rustling leaves. He tried to calm down. "You're imagining things," he told himself. "You're tired." But deep down, he knew what he saw. That night, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. He searched online for any information about Margaret Hayes. Most of the results were old news archives. No social media, no recent records. It was as if she had disappeared completely. But then, on a small genealogy website, he found something: a Margaret H. living just 2 towns away. Same birth year, 1953. His heart pounded. Could it really be her? The next morning, Ethan drove to Fairview, a quiet town surrounded by forests. He followed the address listed online: a small, pale blue house at the end of a gravel road. He parked outside and sat there for a moment, unsure what to do. Then he stepped out and walked to the porch. An old woman opened the door before he could even knock. Her hair was silver, her face gentle but strong. She looked at him with eyes that felt strangely familiar, the same soft eyes from the photograph. "Yes," she said calmly. Ethan's voice trembled. "Ma'am, are you Margaret Hayes?" The woman hesitated, studying his face carefully. Then she nodded slowly. "I haven't heard that name in years." Ethan held out the photograph. "I found this in my grandmother's attic." Margaret's eyes widened. Her hand shook as she took the picture. "Where did you get this?" "It belonged to my grandmother, Helen Miller," Ethan said. "My grandfather was Thomas Miller." For a long moment, Margaret didn't speak. She looked out the window, her eyes filling with tears. Then she whispered, "Thomas. I thought this picture was gone forever." Ethan swallowed hard. "You knew him?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I loved him." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Margaret turned back to Ethan and said softly, "You shouldn't be here, Ethan Miller. Some stories were meant to stay buried." The small blue house felt frozen in time. The furniture was old but clean, and the smell of lavender filled the air. Ethan sat quietly across from Margaret Hayes, unsure what to say next. She held the faded photograph in her trembling hands, running her fingers gently over it. The same photo Ethan had found in his grandmother's attic, except now, it felt alive again. Finally, Margaret spoke softly. "Thomas took this picture. It was spring, 1975. The last day I saw him." Ethan leaned forward. "My grandfather?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes. Thomas Miller. We were supposed to get married that summer. But life had other plans." Her voice cracked a little. She placed the photo on the table and sighed. "Your grandmother? Helen, she was kind. But she didn't know everything." Ethan frowned. "Didn't know what?" Margaret looked up, her gray eyes full of old memories. "Thomas and I were in love, but both our families were against it. My father thought Thomas wasn't good enough. Thomas's family wanted him to focus on the family business, not marry the daughter of a farmer. We tried to fight it, but..." She stopped, wiping her eyes. "One night, things got bad. I found out I was pregnant." Ethan froze. The room suddenly felt smaller. "I told Thomas," she continued, her voice trembling. "He wanted to run away with me, start a new life. We planned everything. But the night before we left, his parents found out. He came to meet me one last time by the lake. That's when I disappeared. Ethan whispered, disappeared. You mean? I left town, she said, finishing his sentence. I thought it would protect him. His father threatened to destroy him if I stayed. So I went away, quietly. Ethan sat back, trying to breathe. My grandmother said they met in college. You're saying? Margaret looked at him carefully. I'm saying that before Helen, there was me. And before the marriage, there was a promise Thomas couldn't keep. She stood up slowly and walked to a small wooden drawer. From it, she pulled out an old envelope, yellow, torn, sealed with wax. She handed it to Ethan. This was meant for me, she said. Thomas wrote it after I left. But it never reached me. I found it years later when I came back to town for my mother's funeral. I never opened it until now. She nodded at him. Go ahead, Ethan. It's time someone knows the truth. Ethan opened the letter carefully. The handwriting was neat, strong, familiar, the same signature he had seen on his grandfather's documents. He began to read. My dearest Margaret. If our child ever asks who he really is, tell him love can survive even in silence. I never stopped loving you. I wanted to find you, but life had its own way. Please forgive me. I'll carry you in every heartbeat until my last. Thomas. Ethan's hands shook as he finished reading. His voice broke as he whispered, our child. Margaret nodded slowly. I lost the baby a few months later, or at least that's what everyone believed. Ethan looked up, confused. What do you mean? Margaret hesitated, tears filling her eyes. I gave birth to a baby girl, but I was too sick to raise her. I left her with someone Thomas trusted. Ethan felt his chest tighten. My grandmother. Margaret looked at him gently, her face pale but calm. Yes, Helen. She was a nurse back then. She promised to protect the child, and Thomas. I owed her everything. Ethan's mouth went dry. So my mother. Margaret nodded again, whispering, your mother was mine. The words hit Ethan like a wave. The air seemed to leave the room. He could hear only the sound of the clock ticking in the corner. All his life, he thought he knew his family, that his grandparents had a simple love story, that his mother had a normal childhood. But now, everything was upside down. He stood up, pacing the small living room. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why hide it for so long? Margaret smiled sadly. Because love isn't always simple, Ethan. Sometimes love means staying silent so others can live in peace. She looked out the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. I came back years later, but Thomas was already gone. He died never knowing I was still here. Ethan felt his throat tighten. And you never tried to tell my grandmother? I wrote letters, Margaret said softly. But I never sent them. Every time I wanted to, I lost the courage. I thought she deserved her happiness. She raised your mother with love. That was enough for me. Ethan nodded slowly, trying to hold back tears. You should have told someone. Margaret smiled faintly. And ruin what they built. No, Ethan. I chose silence. But you found the photo. Maybe that means it's finally time for the truth to come out. Ethan looked down at the letter again, his hands trembling. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice through the words full of regret, love, and pain. He folded the letter carefully and said, I'll find out everything, Margaret. You deserve that. Margaret reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. Be careful, Ethan. The past has a way of hurting those who dig too deep. As he left the house, the wind picked up again. The cherry tree in her front yard swayed softly, petals falling onto the path like whispers from another time. Ethan got into his car, the letter on the seat beside him. He looked at the photograph once more, the young woman smiling under the cherry tree, full of life and love. He whispered, "I'll finish your story." As he started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror and for a split second, he saw Margaret standing by the window, holding the locket close to her heart, and crying. When Ethan drove back to the old Miller house, the sky was already dark. The headlights cut through the fog on the narrow road, and his heart beat faster with every turn. He couldn't stop thinking about what Margaret had told him, that his mother was her daughter. It felt impossible, like a dream he didn't want to believe. Inside the house, the air was cold and silent. The same photograph and locket lay on the desk where he had left them. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring. He whispered, "Grandma, why didn't you ever tell me?" He sat down and read the letter from Thomas again. Every word felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "If our child ever asks who he really is, tell him love can survive even in silence." Ethan looked up toward the attic door. The voice in his head told him to stop, to let it go, but another part of him whispered that the truth was waiting upstairs. He climbed the creaky wooden ladder once more. The attic smelled the same: dust, rain, and old secrets. The light bulb flickered as if warning him. He began searching again, pulling boxes aside, opening drawers, lifting old blankets. He was about to give up when he noticed something strange. A small section of the floorboards near the window looked newer than the rest. The nails were different, shiny and clean. Ethan fetched a screwdriver and pried the boards open carefully. Beneath them was a hidden compartment, covered in layers of dust. His heart pounded as he reached inside. He pulled out a metal box wrapped in an old piece of fabric. Inside the box were several items: a folded birth certificate, a faded hospital bracelet, and the missing half of the torn photograph. Ethan unfolded the certificate first. The paper was fragile, yellow with age. The child's name was written clearly: Laura Miller. That was his mother's name. But under mother, it said Margaret Hayes. The line for father was blank. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was proof, undeniable proof, that Margaret had been telling the truth. He turned to the photograph next. He fitted perfectly with the piece he had found earlier. Now, the full picture came together: Thomas and Margaret standing side by side under the cherry tree, smiling. In Thomas's hand was the same heart-shaped locket that now sat on Ethan's desk. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. His grandparents, or rather, the people he thought were his grandparents, had built their life on a secret to protect everyone else. He whispered, "You loved her, Grandpa. You never stopped." He picked up the hospital bracelet next. A tiny tag read, "Baby Laura, June 1975. He held it gently, afraid it might crumble. Suddenly, a soft sound echoed through the attic like footsteps. Ethan froze and turned around. No one was there. The air felt heavy. The light bulb flickered again, brighter this time. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow near the window, shaped like 2 people standing together. But when he blinked, it was gone. He laughed nervously. "I'm losing it," he muttered. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was alive, like it was finally exhaling after keeping the truth buried for so long. Ethan took the box downstairs and placed it beside the photograph and the locket. He sat on the floor and stared at everything, his mind racing. Now it all made sense. Helen, the woman he had called Grandma, wasn't trying to hide the truth for herself. She had done it for love. She had promised to protect Margaret's baby and Thomas's reputation. She had sacrificed her own story so others could live peacefully. Ethan wiped his eyes and smiled sadly. She wasn't lying when she said some stories belong in boxes. He looked around the room. The shadows felt softer now. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange calm. But there was still one thing left to do. He needed to tell Margaret what he had found. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly, and called the number she had given him. The line rang several times before a weak voice answered. "Hello. Margaret, it's Ethan," he said quickly. "I found something in the attic." "You were right. The birth certificate, the photo, everything." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then she whispered, "You found the truth." "I did," Ethan said softly. "My mother, she was your daughter." Margaret began to cry quietly. "I knew Helen would keep her safe. She was a good woman." "She was," Ethan said, feeling tears in his own eyes. "She loved you, too. I think that's why she kept the photo. She couldn't destroy it." Margaret took a deep breath. "Ethan, thank you. You don't know what this means to me." He smiled faintly. "I think I do." Before hanging up, Margaret said one last thing. "Take care of the locket, Ethan. It's more than jewelry. It's a promise, one that waited 40 years to be complete." The call ended. Ethan sat there for a long time, staring at the locket. He opened it again. Inside was a tiny, faded picture: Thomas holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blanket. His mother. A tear rolled down Ethan's cheek. He whispered, "You kept your promise, Grandpa." The storm outside had stopped. The first light of dawn touched the window, making the dust sparkle in the air. Ethan placed the photo, the birth certificate, and the locket carefully back into the box. But this time, he didn't hide it. He left it open on the table, a secret finally free. Upstairs, the attic door creaked softly as if someone had just closed it. Ethan looked up, smiled, and whispered into the quiet house. "It's okay now. She knows." The next morning, sunlight filled the Miller house for the first time in days. It felt warmer now, softer, as if the house itself could finally breathe again. Ethan sat by the window, watching the golden light touch the old trees outside. On the table in front of him lay the photo, the birth certificate, and the heart-shaped locket, the three pieces that had rebuilt a forgotten story. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel angry or confused. He felt peace. He finally understood his grandmother, his grandfather, and Margaret. They had all loved deeply, but they had loved in silence. Still, one thing remained undone. He had to see Margaret Hayes one last time. He got into his car and drove back to Fairview, carrying the small box with him. The road was quiet, covered in yellow leaves that swirled in the autumn wind. When he reached Margaret's house, the curtains were drawn, and the front door stood slightly open. Ethan knocked gently. "Margaret." "It's me, Ethan." No answer. He stepped inside. The air was still, and the faint smell of lavender floated through the room. Margaret was sitting by the window in a rocking chair, wrapped in a shawl. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow but calm. When she opened her eyes and saw him, she smiled weakly. "You came back." Ethan nodded and sat beside her. "I found everything. The birth certificate, the other half of the photo. I know the truth now." She smiled softly. "Then it's finally done." Ethan placed the locket in her hand. "You should have this. It was yours first." Margaret looked at the small heart-shaped locket and whispered, "I never thought I'd see this again." She opened it and smiled at the tiny picture inside: Thomas holding a baby in his arms. "He always wanted to protect both of you," she said quietly. "Helen, she did what I couldn't." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "She loved you too, Margaret. I think she kept your memory alive in her own way." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Then maybe we weren't enemies after all. Maybe we were just two women who loved the same man and the same child." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunlight move slowly across the floor. Margaret spoke again, her voice soft but steady. Thomas used to say that love doesn't end when people leave. It waits just like the cherry tree by the lake. Ethan smiled faintly. It's still there. I saw it. Her eyes brightened. Does it still bloom? Yes, Ethan said. Every spring. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered, then he kept his promise. Ethan looked at her, realizing she was fading not just in body, but peacefully, like someone finally setting down a heavy burden. She took his hand and pressed the locket into his palm. Keep it, she said. It belongs to the future now. He wanted to say something to thank her, to promise he'd tell her story, but his voice broke. Margaret smiled one last time. Tell them, we were real. Her hand grew still. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the clock. Ethan sat there for a long time, holding her hand. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound of distant birds. He didn't cry at first. He just breathed, feeling both loss and peace at the same time. Later, he walked outside. The cherry tree in Margaret's yard was blooming, small pink flowers shining under the morning sun, even though it wasn't spring. He smiled through his tears. Goodbye, Margaret. That evening, Ethan returned to the Miller house. He climbed the attic ladder one last time. The light was soft now, no flickering, no shadows. Just calm. He placed the photograph and the locket back inside the small wooden box. But instead of hiding it under the floorboards, he set it on the shelf near the window. He whispered, "Your story's safe now." As he turned to leave, a gentle breeze moved through the attic, though the window was closed. The box lid opened slightly on its own. Ethan smiled. "I know," he whispered. "You're welcome." He walked down the ladder, turned off the light, and for the first time since he'd entered that attic, it felt peaceful. Days later, Ethan wrote an article, not a novel this time, but a true story titled "The Photograph in the Dust." He didn't use real names. He just wrote about love, time, and how some promises lie beyond generations. The story went viral online. Thousands of people commented, saying it made them cry, saying it reminded them of someone they had lost. Ethan smiled every time he read a comment. He knew his grandmother, his grandfather, and Margaret somewhere were smiling too. One morning, as he sat by the attic window finishing his coffee, he noticed something strange. On the windowsill, a single cherry blossom petal had fallen fresh and pink. He looked outside. There were no cherry trees nearby. He picked up the petal and laughed softly. "You kept your promise, didn't you?" He placed the petal inside the locket and closed it gently. The story was complete now. The camera slowly pans over the attic. The box sits open under the sunlight, the locket shining softly. Through the window, the sky glows pink, and for a moment, two shadows appear near the cherry tree outside, standing hand in hand before fading away with the wind.